Hey guys, what's up? It's the new sensation, Bigger Notation, bringing you guys another video. Um, like I've mentioned in a couple of my other recent videos, I apologize for the infrequent uploads because I've got my exams this month. I'm just coming up to halfway through them now, so getting through it slowly but surely. But obviously, because I have to revise my exams, I am a little bit delayed in focusing on the YouTube. As soon as I'm done with my exams, I'm going to spend a lot more time on this channel and on my streams as well. I'm going to be doing like daily streams much more consistently and all of that jazz. If you're interested in checking out the Twitch channel, I do stream almost daily from Monday to Friday, so definitely check that out. Link will be in the description. Getting straight onto the video though. Also, thank you guys for all of the support and stuff, sticking with me through my exams. I really appreciate it, so thank you very much. Getting straight into the video, today I am bringing you guys a Lord Slug mill deck. So, a couple of things to cover that I wanted to cover before diving into the deck profile. I have been messing around with Lord Slug for a little while now. One of my mates has been on it. Me and him really both love mill decks. Janemba Mill was actually the first deck that I played when I first started consistently playing Dragon Ball. I played a little bit around the Cell deck with the Cell Chain, where you could rip your opponent down to 3 cards. I played a tiny bit in that format, but it was a lot more casual play. When I first started like actually going to locals every week, it was Janemba format, and I would just borrow a Janemba deck off of one of my mates for a long time, and Mill was my favorite deck style to play. And in the game I played before Dragon Ball Super, which was the Final Fantasy trading card game, I actually played, I think it was a 7 color or 5 color mill deck. It was very fun. And I did very well with it. It was one of my favorite decks that I've played in any card game. It was a lot of fun. But I really enjoy Mill. Mill and Hand Destruction are like my 2 favorite deck archetypes. And so Lord Slug I've been having a lot of fun with. I've recently managed to put together the funds for copies of Dormant Potential in real life. So that is the reason why I'm primarily bringing you guys this deck, because I'm actually going to be able to play it in real life now that I have the most expensive cards of the deck. So I'm very excited about that, and so I've been playing a little bit of Lord Slug more recently. The only reason that I wasn't playing it before was because I didn't have the money for the Dormant Potentials, so I just figured there wasn't much point because Dormant Potential is really necessary. This list is updated with the new ban list where Roshi is banned, so I tried to accommodate for that just a little bit. And again, that's another reason why I wasn't playing the deck previously, because of the Roshi ban, meaning that full Dormant Potential is almost completely necessary for this deck. A couple of shoutouts that I want to mention just before we dive straight in. First of all, shout out to Scrub Games for originally suggesting for me to profile the Slug Mill deck on my channel. If you guys want to suggest any decks, you can leave it in the description of any of my videos or in the comments. I mean, I check all of the comments regularly. I really enjoy the support that you guys give me. And to everyone who has suggested decks all along here, I promise I will get to them. Even people who have suggested 2 decks, I am getting round to everyone's suggestions as I can, but like I've already said quite a few times, I've got my exams right now, so it's taking me a little while, and also my locals haven't, my online locals have been cancelled due to some unforeseen circumstances, so I'm not going to be able to bring that many consistent gameplays to the highest quality, but I will do what I can. I will try and find the time for these things, and I will definitely be able to get the time in the summer, so just bear with me. I will get around to everything, and I really appreciate everyone who's made suggestions and everyone who keeps supporting the channel. Thank you very much. And the second shout out that I want to give is to the Eggman channel. I feel like he kind of popularized the Slug Mill with his top 32 deck profile that he did here. I'll probably have the link to this in the description as well. But this is what first caught my eye when I was originally building the Slug Mill deck, even before it was suggested to me by Scrub Games over here. When I saw this video, I immediately tried it out, but obviously this video was made previous to the Roshi ban, and there were also a couple of cards that I disagreed with in this video, so I've gone and made my own list, new and updated here, and I'll go through a couple of my choices and a couple of my thoughts for what could be done during the set 13 format as well, because I think that this deck is pretty good in set 13, and I think that there are possibly a few changes that could be made, although there's not very many, to be honest. But we'll delve right straight into the deck profile after all of my ramblings. We'll get right into it. So the primary engine, most of the deck is pretty engine focused, like archetype focused, like with a lot of the set 12 decks and some of the more recent decks. It's mostly just stick all of the good cards for the color into the deck with the engine cards, and it works fine. As you can see here, this deck is 60 cards. Personally, I prefer to only ever play 50 card decks. Even if it's 51 or 52, I'll always be looking to cut it down to 50, just for the maximum consistency. I think that 50 is always the correct number, but because of the style of this deck and because it's a mill deck, you actually want to be running 60 cards, because the way that the deck works is it's parallel mill, so you're drawing cards and your opponent is drawing almost exactly the same number of cards as you are. So if you were to run 50 cards each, then you would actually end up milling yourself out quite a few times in some games as well, because your opponent actually has the opportunity to put cards back into their deck, whereas you don't. So if you were to run 50 cards in the deck, you would actually mill yourself out if you played against some really seasoned players. So that is the reason why you have to run 60 cards for this deck, and it actually allows for a lot of interesting deck building choices, in my opinion, because it means that searchable cards become much more prioritized in the deck, because you're going to be seeing them less consistently anyway, and it also allows you more room for more tech choices, and I think that that's really important, especially in the current state of card games, because most of the tournaments that we have right now are going to be webcam based, and they're going to be best of one. So if you're looking for a good best of one pick, I maybe wouldn't recommend this deck just because it's a little bit tricky to pilot, and it's a control deck, so it's a little bit less favored in best of one. Obviously aggro decks are a lot easier to play in best of one because you're looking to just kill them turn 1, turn 2, turn 3. But if you are looking for a deck with a wide range of options to run for tech choices, this could be actually a pretty good deck. And if it's a much slower meta and it remains a best of one format, this deck could be really good, because this deck is exceptional against control decks. I've just actually finished a game against a Topo Apes deck with the Topo leader that limits each player to playing one battle card a turn, and this deck just absolutely stomps those decks out, because they're looking to take a while to set up their game plan, and this is kind of like a combo deck similar to Invoker, but the combo is just milling your opponent out, because you have an inevitable win condition. It's like your deck becomes a time bomb rather than you have to get to your opponent's life, and sometimes this deck will get through your opponent's life as well because it goes very wide. Alright, well, enough of my general explanations of why I like this deck so much. I'll get right into the cards. So one of the main centerpieces of the deck is this 1-drop. I'm running 4 copies of it, and it has unique, which is important to note, because oftentimes on your kill turn, if your opponent's at like 10 cards left in deck, a lot of your turn becomes attacking with a card and then comboing this guy off so that you can play more copies of him to get your opponent to draw more cards. And that's really important to think about when you're looking to kill them. But it has an auto. When it comes into play, you and your opponent draw a card, and then at the end of your turn, your opponent chooses up to 1 card in their hand and places it at the bottom of the deck. So this is optional, this is your opponent's choice, and often earlier in the game, especially if your opponent doesn't know what the deck does, they'll often choose to keep the cards in their hand, and that's actually good for your game plan because it means there are fewer cards left in your opponent's deck. He also has an activate main, If your opponent has 7 or more cards in hand, which is really easy to achieve with this deck, you get this stuff almost every turn, and 1 or more energy, you get to play down a mono-green Slug's Army card with 19k power or less from your hand. But this is a hard activate main once per turn, so you can't use it on even copies of the card, so you can't activate the main effect and then attack and combo this off and play another copy down to use the effect again. Oh, I forgot, I haven't even been over the leader yet. So the leader is just pretty simple. When it attacks, you and your opponent draw a card, and then it has a second auto, which is like another awakening condition. If you have 3 or more energy and you activate Rejuvenate, you draw 2 cards and flip it over, but you generally not going to be doing that skill. I don't think I've ever done it in any of my testing so far. Generally what you're doing is when your life is at 4 or less, you and your opponent draw a card, and then you can untap 2 and flip it over. This is better just because it allows you to play more cards, so you get to mill your opponent down faster, and it also mills your opponent down further. And this is, I'm going to call this a hard mill. So there's soft mills like this 1-drop, where your opponent gets to put up to 1 card back to their deck. This is a hard mill, and so is the auto on swing, because your opponent can't put it back, it's forced. And then on the backside, it's a 20k base leader, but if your opponent has 7 or fewer cards in their hand, it gets minus 5k power. This is really good against swarm decks and low to the ground aggro decks. This is really helpful against, so like against Vegex or maybe like something similar to that. Just any deck that swarms, it'll probably be pretty good against the new red Bardock deck that comes out in set 13. Any deck that just swarms the board rather than going tool, this is going to be really good against, because the only time that this permanent won't really help you will probably be when your opponent goes for a kill turn, because they'll be comboing their hand on their kill swing. And this leader also keeps the auto, so when it attacks, you and your opponent draw a card. And it has a activate main. If your opponent has 10 or more cards in their hand, you get to free play a Slug's Army with energy cost 2 or less from your drop area. That is really easy to pull off. You're pulling this off almost every turn on your awaken side, and it's also really powerful. You have quite a few targets in the deck, which is really nice. It pluses you very hard. Something that's also important to note is that it only gets the minus 5k power on your opponent's turn during battles, so on your turn you're always swinging for 20k no matter what. So we've covered the main 1-drop. Some of the targets for the 1-drop are this 3-drop Lord Slug, which I'm running 4 of. This is your main removal for the deck, so if all of your energy is mono green, you get to play it. Then you and your opponent draw a card. This is a soft mill, so your opponent can put it back after the turn. And then you get to KO one of your opponent's battle cards. This doesn't ignore barrier, which is something to note. This deck really struggles with barrier removal in general, but it's just really good removal. And it doesn't have a specific cost to it, which is really important to note because most of the other removal in the deck does. And it's 19k power, so you can play it off of the 1-drop. I'll go over the other main targets for the 1-drop now as well. I'm also running 4 of these Thwarter of Plans. So it's got Deflect, which is really, really key. Oftentimes you just want to be getting a card out on the board, and if you want to do that safely, then this is your best bet because it has Deflect. It also has Bond 2. This effect is very similar to the 2-drop Bardock Unison, where when your opponent combos, you get to get rid of the combo once per turn. And if you do, you and your opponent draw 1 card, but then it negates the skill for the turn. So it's a hard once per turn, but it's also a hard mill, so that's really important to note. And then it also has some nice floating effect where if it's removed by a skill or KO'd, then if your opponent has 7 or more cards in hand, you get to revive a 1-drop from your drop area. So this is a really, really strong card. This is generally going to be your turn 1 play going second if you can get your 1-drop out. And if you can get multiple copies of this card out, you can just burn through your opponent's combos super quickly. And if you're pressuring your opponent hard, then they're put in a tricky situation of either taking the life and going down to really low life, or comboing and furthering your mill win condition. So this card is mainly where the multiple win conditions of the deck really open up, because it forces your opponent into really tricky situations. The final main target for your 1-drop Lord Slug is the Anguilla. We're only running 3 copies of this because it's only really good in the early game or sometimes in the very late game if your opponent puts on a lot of pressure. but its auto is if all of your energy is mono green, when it's played from your hand, you get to, if you're at the end of your turn, if you have 6 or fewer cards in hand and your opponent has 10 or more, you get to draw 3. So it's really good. Obviously a draw 3 is amazing for a card, but oftentimes in testing I've actually found it really tricky to go down below 7 cards in hand and to meet the condition of having 6 or fewer. So that's something to watch out for, and I find that you're normally only playing 1 copy of this card per game, and the other copies you're either charging or comboing away. But we're running 3 copies because the deck is 60 cards, and this card is so powerful that it's really important that you see at least 1 in the game. So the unison that we're playing is 4 copies of the King Piccolo. It has Rejuvenate for 4 markers, which is pretty nice, and that is going to meet the condition of your Leader's Awakening skill to draw 2. Although you're not going to be using Rejuvenate all that often, this only really comes into play in the later stages of the game. It has an activate main for 1 green, where if your opponent has 7 or more cards in hand, you get to play it from your hand with a marker on it. So it effectively just becomes a 1-cost unison, which is really nice, and just really energy efficient and really good for tempo. Oftentimes you don't really worry about the number of markers your unison has, because you just want to get the activate main off immediately. And once you get the +1 off, you'll have enough markers on your unison to make Dormant and Freezer live. So that's all that you really need in this deck. And it is also a 15k. There are quite a few times where you do play it for the 2 energy just because you don't have anything else to do with your energy, but this activate main is really, really nice just to have as an option. So it has a +1 activate main, where you get to choose a card from your hand and place it under this card. Then you and your opponent draw 1 card. This is another soft mill because your opponent gets to put it back. Then you get to free play a 1-drop green battle card from your hand, which is really nice because you have quite a few targets in the deck to free play. Obviously you have your 1-drop Lord Slug, which can then go into one of your bigger Lord Slugs, and you also have this Anguilla, which I'll go over now. So this Anguilla is very simple. It's just a searcher of the top 5 cards of your deck. You get to search for a mono green Slugs army card with an energy cost of 3 or less, or up to 1 mono green unison card with an energy cost of 2. So that will be your King Piccolo. And we have 4 copies of that as well, just for maximum consistency. A lot of these cards are going to be 3 or 4 copies. Normally I really don't like that in a deck, but because it's 60 cards you still have room for your tech choices, which I'll get to at the end. But normally I really dislike that about some deck builds, but because it's 60 cards it's acceptable, I think. Some of the other more situational cards that we run that is also part of the Slugs and Army engine. This is another really key card, Meta Matcha. So we have 4 copies of this, and it is a 2-drop 10k, but none of that really matters. The only thing that matters is it's a 0-5k, so you can combo it off for free, and it has a drop area effect only. So its effect is 1 green energy. If all of your energy is mono green, you send it from your drop area to your warp. Then it has a lot of effects. So you get to add up to 1 card from your life to your hand, play 1 meta token, which is a 5k token, I believe, but it also has a 0-5k combo power, which is really important. That's the only thing that really matters about the token. And then you and your opponent draw 2 cards, but the only sad part about this effect is that the 2 cards are a soft mill, because your opponent gets to put up to 2 cards back to their deck. You can only, this is also another hard once per turn like the Lord Slug, so you can't activate copies on other cards of this activate main for the turn. So it's very important that if you have copies of this in your drop area and you have the energy spare, you want to be burning through these at least once every turn. You really want to get through these so that you get maximum value out of your mills, because this is the only card in the deck that can mill 2. And even though it's a soft mill, oftentimes your opponent just keeps the 2 because they don't understand that they're going to get milled out so much faster than they expect. So 4 copies of this is really, really key. And if you ever have spare energy open and you don't think you're going to die next turn, you want to be tapping 1 for this, because not only are you milling your opponent 2, but you're actually drawing 3 cards if you're taking the life. And oftentimes early game you are taking the life, because a lot of people actually struggle to pressure down the leader against this deck. So oftentimes you'll reach turn 3 or 4 and not even be awakened yet. So taking the life in this is really good, unless you're against an aggro deck, obviously. A few of the other Lord Slug cards that we're running 4 of this guy. I don't know how to pronounce his name. I think it's like Zune, the Loyal. He's basically just a free blocker because our leader is a Lord Slug. And that's really nice, especially in a green deck, because it means that you can activate Dormant Potential on your opponent's first swing and then block it in the same swing, because the blocker and the negate happen in separate windows. So you're actually able to stop the attack with the blocker and then potentially negate the next attack, which is really important, and that actually mitigates for a lot of the weaknesses of Dormant Potential, which is amazing. And the Meta Matcha mitigates for a lot of the other weaknesses of Dormant Potential, because Meta Matcha is a great discard target because it has a drop area effect, obviously. Also, just because we're a control deck, it's good to have free blockers, and this is actually revivable off of your leader's backside effect, because it's a 2-drop Slug's Army, so you can bring it back out from the drop area if you feel like you need another blocker. So that's really nice. A couple of the other Lord Slug cards we have are this 2-drop Lord Slug Return to Form. This is 3 copies in this deck. It's a very simple card. Just when you play it, you get to search your deck for a Slug's Army card with an energy cost of 4 or less. The main reason that this card is in here is because, first of all, you can play it off of your 1-drop Lord Slug. If you don't have any other targets, it's okay, because it has 19k power or less. However, most of the time you want to be playing one of your other targets. But the main reason that it's in here is because, again, it is playable off of your leader's backside effect because it costs 2. So you can actually play this guy off your leader's backside effect if you don't want to be milling your opponent, or you already have a 1-drop out. And then you just get to search for almost your entire battle card engine. So you can search for a free blocker if you need, you can search for Meta Matcha if you need, you can search just for an Anguilla if you have energy open and you want to make use of it. And then you can also search for targets for your 1-drop Lord Slug. It's just really nice to have, and it allows for a lot of searchability in the deck. And like I mentioned closer to the start of this video, because the deck is 60 cards, searchability is really key in this deck, because you're going to be seeing each of your cards less consistently. So having the ability to search them out anytime you want and have kind of a toolbox of so many different cards whilst having space for tech choices at the bottom is really important. And that's one of the strengths of actually having a 60 card deck. If you have that searchability and that draw power, it doesn't actually hinder you all that much. And the only place that it will ever really hinder you in this deck is in your opening mulligan, and if you can mulligan correctly, then oftentimes it won't even hinder you there. I believe this is the last of the Slug's Army cards. We have 2 copies of the Lord Slug Young again. He is a 4-drop. I'm still really unsure on this card. I haven't properly tested it out yet. I've been testing this deck for a little while, but this is one of the cards that I haven't seen all that consistently, and I haven't been able to play all that consistently. So I'm really unsure on it. It hasn't come up very much yet, but this is kind of a flex spot in my opinion. So this could be maybe 2 copies of the Monstrous Muscle card, the Lord Slug Monstrous Muscle that clears the board if you need more board clears. It could be kind of whatever. It really depends on what the meta is, but I think that just because this is a Slug's Army card and it's searchable off of your 2-drop, it's actually just pretty nice to have in here, and hopefully it will work well. But anyway, it has an auto of Bond 2 for Slug's Army. When you play it, you just get to revive a 3-drop or less Slug's Army from your drop area, and then you get to restand an energy. So it effectively costs 3 energy, and you just get to revive out a 3-drop. So it's pretty nice. It's very energy efficient, because you're effectively getting a 0-cost 20k body. But I'm still not sure how good it is, and if it gets counterplayed, then it's really bad in terms of tempo and value. So counterplays are very important to watch out when playing this card, and this could definitely be a flex spot. One of the issues that I found with this deck is obviously a lot of green is very hand destruction based, because a lot of the previous green archetypes have been hand destruction archetypes, like the starter deck Freezer, the OG Broly, etc, etc. And in this deck, you're looking to give your opponent a big hand, not a small hand. So a lot of the general good cards like Cell's Earth Destroying Kamehameha don't really fit into this deck, because destroying your opponent's hand is actually bad for this deck's game plan, because a lot of the card effects require your opponent to have a certain number of cards in their hand. So I found that that's actually kind of really frustrating when building this deck, because you can't run a lot of the really strong green cards. But speaking of really strong green cards, I am running 4 copies of Dormant Potential Unleashed. This deck is made post the Roshi ban, so you have to run 4 copies of this card. I'm sorry to all the budget players out there who might want to play this deck. You're going to really struggle without this card. This card carries the deck so hard because it's such a strong floodgate, and in a control deck, floodgates are obviously key, because they give you so much value and they stall out the game plan of your opponent. So against aggro decks, this is just how you win. Dormant Potential is so good, and yeah, there's nothing really more I can say about it. It's just such a good card. You have to run 4 copies of it, because I'm going to call this a control deck quite a lot, but I think it's kind of a combo deck as well, because it has that inevitability of a combo deck. And in a combo deck, all of your cards are a means to an end, because all of your cards, I think the term is zero sum, where all of your cards, you're only looking to kill them with that inevitable game plan. So even if you expend all of your resources, as long as you can get your opponent to 0 cards in deck, it doesn't matter, you've won the game. And that's kind of what I mean by how key Dormant Potential is, because stalling extra turns in a combo deck is really, really important. Obviously you can kill your opponent normally, because this deck goes really wide with how many free play guys it has, but oftentimes you are just milling them out. And the only times that I find that you are killing them normally is with Cell Xeno, or by applying the pressure of the Bond 2 effect of this guy. So, enough of my ramblings yet again. I really love card games, as you can probably tell from how much I talk about them, but I tend to get very sidetracked a lot of the time. But back to the just going through the deck profile, I'm running 4 copies of Freezer Charismatic Villain. I'm actually running 6 Unisons in this deck, so 4 copies of Freezer Charismatic Villain is very key, and you're just looking to disrupt your opponent occasionally on your opponent's turn. This is really good, just like Dormant Potential, against aggro decks, but also pretty good against control decks, because a lot of cards are 7 or less, and so you can kill quite a few cards with this. For my secret rare of choice, I'm running Cell Xeno. This is similar to the 4-drop Lord Slug in that I haven't been able to properly test it yet, because there's such a low quantity of it in the deck, because you can obviously only run 1 secret rare in the deck. This was taken from Eggman's video, the idea to run Cell Xeno, because like he said in his video, you actually swarm the board quite a lot, and so getting Cell Xeno down is pretty simple. You have so many different cheap cards, and because a lot of your board swarms are like 1 to 3 cost, you're very flexibly able to bring out this card, because 12 isn't a very tricky number for this deck to reach, but you can reach it in so many different ways, just by naturally filling out your game plan, that Cell Xeno is a good card to run. If you don't have Cell Xeno, or you want to make the deck even more control based and combo based, I would definitely recommend running the Heroine's Lineage SCR, but you could also run the Great Ape SCR if you're specifically worried about cards that cost larger than 7. So if you're maybe considering, maybe if it's like an aggro sin meta where a lot of the opponent's cards cost 8 or more, or they have barrier, or you're specifically worried about a card like Cell Xeno, I would recommend running the Great Ape SCR for green instead. But either of those two would be really good, and I'm honestly considering switching out Salzino for one of those two, just because it gives you that, it contributes much better towards your inevitable game plan of milling them out, and that's obviously better for a combo deck. Survivability is key for combo decks, but I do like the Salzino because you're often reaching 5 energy, so you're often able to apply the auto effect of the Salzino and get that dual attack. But also, I do like the idea of being able to just surprise your opponent with the Salzino when they might just be thinking you're going for the mill game plan, and it kind of, again, puts your opponent in a really tricky situation where they have to be scared of the Salzino if they know that you're running it, but they also, so they have to like keep their hand big so that they can either out combo or negate the attacks, but they also have to keep their hand small because they want to keep putting back cards to the bottom of their deck so they don't mill out. So it can put your opponent in really tricky situations to run the Salzino, but for the other reasons that I mentioned before, you could definitely run the Heroine's Lineage or the Great Ape SCR over it, because they would also contribute massively to the deck's game plan. For my super combos, I've gone for a 2-2 split. I really hate 2-2 splits on super combos. I think that generally they're just quite poorly devised, in my opinion, because I feel like one of them is always going to be better. I can understand if there's like specific matchups where one is better and one isn't better, but generally I really hate 2-2 splits. The only reason that I'm running this the 2-2 split of Jiro and Great Saiyan Man at the moment is because Eggman was running 4 Jiro in his video, and that was mostly to tutor out Meta Matcha and to tutor out the Master Roshi. Because of the Master Roshi ban, you don't have 8 targets for the Jiro anymore, you only have 4. So I don't think 4 Jiro is warranted in the deck anymore, but I think that Jiro is still good in the deck because getting Meta Matcha into the drop area is very, very important for the deck. So for that reason, I just decided to cut it down to 2 copies so that I could put at least 2 copies of Meta Matcha into the drop area in a game, and then also have the flexibility of the draw super combo and being able to have better defensive options against aggro decks. So Jiro is more for against control decks, and the Great Saiyan Man super combo is much more for against aggro decks. So that's kind of my reasoning behind the 2-2 split here. There is actually a matchup theory craft behind it, so that is my reasoning behind it. But generally, I really hate 2-2 splits, and I just don't think that they're very good. I would love to hear some people's reasoning as to why they might run 2-2 splits in other decks. Let me know in the comments for sure. I'm really curious to hear lots of people's reasonings behind it, and what decks you play 2-2 splits in and why, and which super combos you chose. But generally, I just really don't like them. I'm not a fan. But that was my reasoning behind running 2 of each here. I'm also running 2 copies of Assimilate. So this card obviously gets a 2 or less green or yellow Namekian. So your main target is going to be your 4 copies of the 1-drop Slug, because this is the main centerpiece of the deck. It lets you free play all of your guys out, and you get to play it off of your Unison. It's just really strong. And having 6 copies of your main card in a 60 card deck is a lot better than having 4 copies. I was considering putting this up to 3 or 4 copies, honestly, but I think that you actually see your Lord Slug consistently enough anyways that you don't need it. And even if you don't see it, your deck has quite a lot of draw power because you're parallel milling yourself and your opponent. So you're actually able to see this 1-drop Lord Slug by turn 2 or turn 3 at the latest most games, and generally it's not massively detrimental to your game plan if you don't see it, unless you're against a really aggressive deck, in which case you're probably looking for like a really strong opening hand anyway, and so it's tricky to tech for those kind of matchups in the main deck without hurting the win rates of your other matchup, sorry. So I would maybe consider side decking some of these for the matchups where you really want to see the 1-drop Lord Slug, but I think that 2 is fine at the moment. I'm just going to go through. So yeah, I knew there was some other search targets. So another search target that you can grab with the assimilate is this 2-drop, and that's just nice if you already have a bunch of 1-drops in your hand or on play, because it has unique, so you can only have one out at a time. And this is just nice to have at least one copy of throughout the game, because you can revive it off of your leader every turn, and that'll just get you a lot of value. This guy isn't a Namekian, so you can't search him, sadly, and nor is this. So it does look like those are your only 2 search targets in the deck, but it's good to have 2 search targets just for situations where you might want to see one over the other, and especially with when one of the search targets has a unique tag, it's really important to have multiple search targets. So these are some of the more techier choices that I've decided to include. I've got 2 copies of Sacrifice. I think that this card is a little bit better than Shocking Death Ball for the deck, just because it's always going to be live, and often your drop area isn't going to be that big during games, so the Sparking 5 can be quite tricky to get off sometimes, especially in more aggressive matchups. Or not in aggressive matchups, sorry, in the slower matchups, often your drop area doesn't get that big because you're not comboing off very many cards. And it is, again, in the slower matchups where you want to be self-awakening a lot more, because they'll probably be trying to clear your board instead of attacking your leader. So Sacrifice is perfect for those slower matchups. But I would recommend side decking some Shocking Death Balls if you're looking to play this deck in a more aggressive meta, or if you're worried about aggressive decks. Shocking Death Ball is obviously a great card for that. I'm also running 2 copies of Bigger More. This card is obviously amazing in green. If anyone's ever played against a Bigger More Roshi loop, I think that was mostly popularized with the Clash Coup deck. Then that's really awful to play against, especially if you're playing a deck like Dark Broly, where it's only ever really your big guys that are attacking. But obviously with the Roshi ban coming down, it's pretty much impossible to loop Bigger More. And that's my reasoning for running 2 copies rather than just the one. Oftentimes you could get away with just running 1 copy and 4 Roshis, but not anymore. This card could honestly go up to 3 copies. It's been overperforming for me quite a lot, so it could go up to 3 copies, because a lot of decks at the moment are cheating out big cards. Like, we have Aggro Sin, we have Dark Broly, even in like a lot of launch decks, they're arrivaling in like the cooler Tyrannical Assault, the 5-drop red-green Gogeta arrival card. There's a lot of cheating in there. And then obviously against Red Broly, you have their 5-drop Red Broly, their 6-drop Red Broly, their SCR if they're running it. Just a lot of decks cheat out big cards. That's kind of what the game has become at this point, and so Bigger More is really good for that. And you could definitely run this at 3 copies, I think. Oftentimes you're not using your energy all that much in your turn, because you're free playing most of your stuff off of your 1-drop Lord Slug. So investing 2 energy into a Bigger More is actually not that expensive for you, and most of your negates during your opponent's turn are free as well. And speaking of free negates, we have 3 copies of Homicidal Clones. I believe this card came out in the Evolution booster, and I think this is a huge boost to the deck. This card is really, really strong, as are most of the parallel cards that were made for all of the other colours. The ability to stop 2 attacks by negating the first attack and then playing down a blocker is really strong, especially in a combo deck where, like I've been saying throughout this video, this deck is, I would consider, a combo deck, and all of your resources are a means to an end. They are, I think it's 0-sum, or it might be that they're not 0-sum. I can't remember which way around it is, but someone let me know in the comments which way around it is. Someone's cleverer than me. But you're just looking to stall out the game and mill them. So being able to stop 2 attacks for 1 card is amazing, and the fact that it allows you to self-awaken if you're at 5 or less life. So if your opponent is trying to swing down your battle cards, you can stop 2 of their attacks on your battle cards and put yourself to 4 life so that you can awaken. It's really, really strong, and I think this card could honestly go up to 4 copies. If you're cutting out maybe the 4-drop Lord Slug or something, you could up this to 4 copies and up the Bigger More to 3 copies. There's a lot of flex spaces in this deck, because obviously you're at 60 cards, so you have 10 more cards in a deck. but I think that Homicidal Clones is a really, really strong card for the deck. And to round off the deck, I'm actually running 2 copies of Vegeta Wrestler Agent of Destruction. There are a few reasons for this. So obviously, one of the cards that came out for the Lord Slug deck, specifically in set 12, I think it was, is the 5-drop Lord Slug, the Monstrous Muscle. And he has the effect where when he comes into play, you get to clear your opponent's board, but it doesn't ignore barrier as far as I remember. He's also a really big, I think he's 25k or 30k beat stick with double strike, and if your opponent uses a counter skill, they discard down to 6 cards, similar to the Cell Chain effect, but only down to 6 cards, not to 3. And it's only if your opponent uses a counter card, so your opponent can play around it. I think that card is pretty good for the deck, but it's just a little bit too expensive. That 5 energy really tips it over the edge, because you have to wait an extra turn over this Vegeta Unison, and you also have to invest obviously an extra energy, so it means that if you are playing the Vegeta Unison on turn 5, you don't have the extra energy open for like a Meta Marcher or a 1-drop Lord Slug or anything like that. And also, I think the pros to the 5-drop Lord Slug is that it is very similar to the Cell Xeno choice in the deck, where it allows you to be more aggressive in the later stages of the game and actually try and kill your opponent rather than just milling them out. But I think that the fact that we already have the Cell Xeno in here means that that's a little bit less important. And the Vegeta Unison actually does the same thing because it has the double strike critical tags, and it's a 25k beta that's a lot harder to kill than the 5-drop Lord Slug. I don't think the 5-drop Lord Slug has barrier. I think it has deflect but not barrier. It might be the other way around, but the 5-drop Lord Slug has a lot less protection just by the fact that it's a battle card, not a unison card. And it also doesn't go through barrier, and there's quite a few matchups where you want to be killing things through barrier. For example, Sin Shenron. If you're playing against a control Sin Shenron deck, or even an aggro Sin Shenron deck, and you somehow make it to turn 4, then getting through their barrier blockers with this card, say if they've copied barrier blocker with their Omega Shenron, this card is going to be much better at dealing with it than the 5-drop Lord Slug is. And one of the other pros to the 5-drop Lord Slug is obviously the fact that it effectively locks your opponent out of playing counter cards. But I feel like most counter cards you can easily play around with this deck, and a lot of counter attacks specifically this deck doesn't really care about, because you have the alternative win condition of milling your opponent out. So you actually don't need to kill your opponent through normal means. So I don't think that the 5-drop Lord Slug is quite as good as this Vegeta Unison. And my last reason for, and also this Vegeta Unison has the inevitability of, if you're against a slower matchup, then you can discard 3 cards out of your opponent's hand. And if you have Cell Xeno down as well, or you have Cell Xeno in your hand, you can rip 6 cards out of your opponent's hand, which will end up probably being around the same as the 5-drop Lord Slug would have done, because your opponent would generally be around 10 or 12 cards at that late stage of the game. So they'll both rip down a total of 6 cards. Obviously, the Vegeta Unison is including the 3 rip from the Cell Xeno, but the Vegeta Unison also rips cards out of your opponent's hand, but it's less of a tricky condition to achieve. And the other reason, which I lost for a second there, was I think running 6 Unisons in a 60 card deck is just better in terms of consistency, because it means that you can actually like one of the issues of running multiple different Unisons in a 60 card deck is that obviously they don't have combo power, so they're tricky to get out of your hand, and they don't do anything when your opponent is looking to kill you. But because it's a 60 card deck, you're going to be seeing each of the Unisons a lot less consistently, and so that means that you're going to be seeing the other cards more consistently than the Unison cards specifically. So that means that the lack of combo power is slightly mitigated by the fact that you're running 60 cards, because you're actually going to see the unison cards so much less. And it means it widens up your options because it allows you to play those specific tech choices and those specific unison tech choices where you can run multiple different unisons in the deck. And I think that that's actually a big advantage of 60 card decks in general, but obviously this deck is kind of forced to be 60 cards because it's a parallel mill deck. So those are some of my reasons for running the Vegeta Unison over the 5-drop Lord Slug. I hope that my random trains of thoughts there made some kind of contingent sense, but if you made it this far, thank you for bearing with me and listening. I tend to ramble quite a bit. I just want to get onto some cards that I was considering running. This is generally what I do with the side deck. Obviously I have the 5-drop Lord Slug Monstrous Muscle, which I was mentioning before. Yeah, so it does have Deflect, it doesn't have Barrier, so it actually dies to quite a lot of things like Frieza Charismatic Villain. Yeah, I can't think of much else off of the top of my head, but there's a lot of battle card disruption, especially during battle at the moment, like Heroine's Lineage SCR as well. So it has a lot less protection than the Unison does, just inherently by being a battle card without Barrier. Another card that I was considering running was the Lord Slug Dark Parasite. I was looking at other board clears that the deck could run, and originally I was like, this is a 4-cost potential board clear, and if it's not a board, and it also helps you with milling because your opponent draws a card and it's a hard mill, and it could also potentially be Unison removal as well. But I ended up going for the Vegeta Unison because it costs the same amount, but it's always going to be a board clear, so you don't have to rely on your opponent picking the incorrect choice there. Another card that I was very intrigued by was this Successor Draft Box 3 card, or Draft Box 6, whatever you want to call it. It's a 6-drop Successor for 1 green with double strike. And it has a bond 3 where when it attacks you either get to KO a rest mode battle card or you get to discard a card from your opponent's hand. My thought process behind this was because it's a random discard, you can actually hit out some pretty good cards from your opponent's hand. And one of the problems with your opponent choosing the discard would be because they have such a big hand, there'll be cards that they don't necessarily need. So the random discard is a little bit better. But I felt like most of the time you'd probably be choosing to KO rest mode battle cards. And I felt like the 6 Successor would be very easy to achieve because you spam the board with 3 drops. And after say the Return to Life or the Anguilla come into play, they're just 19k beat sticks. So you can actually turn them into a consistent value generator with this Successor. But I ended up not choosing to run it in the deck because, first of all, it's a green-yellow card, so it will slightly clog up the hand, and you already have quite a few cloggy cards in the deck. Like you have a few Unison cards, you have the green-yellow Cell, and you have quite a few extra cards, albeit most of them are negates, so that does help quite a lot. But it's just something to note that it's green-yellow, so it's quite cloggy, and it's not something you can charge because a lot of your cards require your energy to all be mono-green. And also I found that the effect just wasn't that useful, because if your opponent's battle cards are in rest mode, a lot of the time the way that you remove your opponent's board is just by attacking into it with your beat sticks. Because you swarm the board so much, you can force your opponent to just lose their board by swinging into it all the time, and you don't have to swing at their leader because you don't need to kill them, you just have to mill them out. So I found that this generally wasn't very useful in theory. But if you want to go for a slightly more green-yellow route, maybe with some arrival cards in the Forge row, you could maybe go for that, but make sure you're always charging mono green in this deck because most of the cards require you to charge mono green. Obviously I was also considering running 2 Shocking Death Ball. This was mainly being considered over the 2 Sacrifice, but honestly, oh, whoops, didn't mean to click that. But it could also be considered running as well as the 2 Sacrifice and maybe over the Young Again Lord Slugs, or even over the Homicidal Clones as well if you're in a more aggressive meta, or or a more board swarming meta, where your opponent is like swarming the board with 1-drops and 2-drops, then this is obviously better. Another card I was actually considering running was the Cooler from the set 13, because initially I thought that this deck would run a lot of green extra cards, and so I thought that this would pretty consistently be a 1 cost, and if this card is, even if this card is at 2 energy cost, rather than 1 cost, then the effect is still really, really good and really strong. And because your opponent is going to have 8 or more cards in hand, they're consistently going to have to discard a card, which, while it's maybe not great for your general strategy, having like 1 or 2 discard cards in the deck isn't too bad for the deck. And the main thing that you're looking for is the counterplay effect here. I found that in practice, because it's a 60 card deck, you're not seeing all of the extra cards so often, so you're actually not filling the drop area up all that much. So this is something to run if you're looking to maybe run a few more extra cards in here, like the Shocking Death Balls, but for this specific build I wasn't running it. And the last card I wanted to consider was the Dark Death Ball. I've been a really big fan of these set 10 counterplays for a little while now. Obviously they're not the most efficient for energy or for their permanent skills that let them play them for alternative costs, and they do require you to have a green unison in play, but I feel like maybe running 1 or 2 copies of this card in the deck wasn't too bad, especially if you're looking to run the Cooler. But I just found that in practice the situation where this card was useful wasn't good enough, or wasn't coming up quite so much. This card could maybe be good in a more aggressive meta. Maybe not in a more aggressive meta. I'm not sure. I'm not sure where this card is good, honestly, because of how expensive it is and because it only hits out 4 or less cards. But theoretically it could be okay. Another final thought for the deck is that you could actually potentially run some Overwhelm cards in here, but from what I've seen of the Overwhelm cards available to us at this current time, there aren't very many that are very good for the deck. Maybe suggest some for me in the comments, but because of the fact that you're using Metamarcha in the drop area quite a lot, and you're not filling up the drop area all that frequently, I would only recommend running 1 or 2 cards with the Overwhelm tag. And I'm not entirely sure what those cards would be quite yet. So if you guys have any suggestions, definitely let me know. Again, shout out to Scrub Games for suggesting the deck, and I will get on to the other suggestions like the Skillless Scuffle Time deck and all of the other ones that everyone suggested. Thank you so much for the support. If you guys made it this far, definitely subscribe, hit the like button. Any support is really, really appreciated, and follow my Twitch down below. I'm getting really close to Twitch affiliate. I'm only, I think, 10 followers off now, so again, just support me out. I really appreciate any of the things that you do for me, and thank you guys for watching, and have a good day.